she saw a lot of suffering that kind of shaped some of her thinking. And as often is the case, oftentimes we will, and particularly non-believers, but all of us will accurately we'll accurately observe problems in the world. But unless we look to Scripture to find the answers, we don't understand what's truly underlying them. She didn't understand the sin nature. If she understood the sin nature, she would have realized that the things that she was saying were the reason for these problems were not the reason for these problems at all. The reason for all of the problems that she was observing was truly the sin nature of man. But she was trying to come up with her own solution for them. But it's important that we understand all of that, which is really a very evil anti-God philosophy, was underlying those pressures and movements. So after the Great War, we had huge economic recovery and went, straight into the Roaring Twenties, as we sometimes refer to them. And, sort of singers, what type of feminism is bubbling under the surface. And the nation became incredibly consumeristic. That was really like the rise of consumerism that has only continued to grow, as we well know, since then. That became the sort of new mantra. And as people had more conveniences, sort of the view of the role of the wife and the mother in the home began to change. You had more a wife and a mom who was fulfilling those responsibilities. In theory, and some of the opinions, you sort of had, sort of scrapping out life wasn't as difficult. You didn't have to carry your water from someplace else. It was coming into your home, and so certain those kinds of things. And so it began to shape sort of a different view of sort of what that role was. And again, it just became very consumeristic in certain ways. One of the quotes was that there was a woman who wrote this book called Selling Mrs. Consumer, and she said, thus the shift from the home as a place of production to a place of consumption was completed. In the new culture of consumption, bolstered by the aids of advertising and the push for consumer credit, this was also in credit first, nobody had heard of that concept before that era, really. All vestiges of 19th century concerns with character, self-restraint, and sacrifice were gone. And so prior to that time, there had been this idea, which is also really an unbiblical idea, but this idea of the Republican motherhood, that women existed to moralize men because just by their presence they were somehow better. Again, clearly not a biblical concept, but that they were the sort of tempering influence over society. Because they had some sort of inherent goodness that men, and men had some sort of inherent greater capacity for evil or something. But this really, as the shift came, they didn't look at them. They didn't look at women that way anymore, and instead they just saw them as sort of moderating this consumerism or feeding it. But of course, that led directly to the Great Depression. All of that hedonism and all of that just wanting more, which, I think we can look now and see, there are parallels, great parallels between sort of what our country is facing now and that sort of just, no self-restraint, and then you have sort of the economic collapse, not to the same degree, but an economic collapse of some point, sort, and then how that impacts people in terms of their reactions. During the Great Depression, a lot of women obviously ended up working because everybody just did whatever they could to scrape things together. But there was a real shift in opinion that was again based on circumstances. A 1936 Gallup poll found that 82% of the population thought that wives should not work if their husbands had a job, and a majority were in favor of legal restrictions. And that was probably primarily because so many men were out of work, not able to support their families. They thought, okay, you shouldn't get to have two jobs in your family. Like, if your husband can work, you shouldn't be working and taking a job from somebody else, another family that needs it. So that was how their convictions were probably driven, or their opinions, more by that reality than by any sort of, Christian ethic or biblical understanding of anything. And so even while women's opportunity to work somewhat shrunk during the Depression, under the Roosevelt administration and others, there was a rise of women in leadership roles. Roosevelt brought in more women in positions of leadership. And Mrs. Roosevelt in particular had some very interesting opinions about women's roles, and obviously is known to have been very influential in her husband's administration. It's one of the quotes that I found said she believed women could bring special contributions to politics, yet she advised them to, quote, leave their, quote, womanly personalities at home. So she seemed to not really understand that. She somehow seemed to think they had unique contributions, but they needed to not really be themselves in order to make those unique contributions, which is, again, something that we'll not see from Scripture. So to fast forward a little bit, we've already talked a little bit about how World War II impacted things. That sort of obviously economically brought the country out of the Depression. And change the economics. There was a huge need for a workforce, so women, we've got the famous image of Rosie the Riveter moving into the factories and being needed in the war efforts, and that drove, the need for labor drove labor policy and opinions, and women moved into the workforce. But when the men came home from war, as many as 80% of women wanted to continue in the jobs that they had had before the war. And you start to see more breakups of families at that time, not staying together, and that's part of it. They were now perhaps heads of their own households because they didn't stay together, perhaps with their husband, and so there was a variety of tensions taking place during that time period, that sort of gives way to the second wave of feminism, which was really brought in by Friedan in about 1963. And she had a whole philosophy of how her philosophy in summary essentially was that women were unhappy because they had to have work in the world in order to be fulfilled. And that's a very prevalent belief today. Among men and women, that our work needs to be what fulfills us. And it's really super easy, even for us as believers, to get caught in that trap and think, I need to feel fulfilled by my job or I'm not going to be happy. Scripture doesn't promise us anything like that. In fact, it says exactly the opposite. It says that Christ is to be what fulfills us. And that we ought to be therefore able to be in the job and work diligently at us, regardless of whether or not we necessarily emotionally find that particularly fulfilling. So there's a lot more to what she taught that was very damaging, and it was heavily influenced by existential thought, and which is really subjective and individual freedom based, and all of those kinds of things that are just antithesis to what Scripture teaches us. And so we're kind of moving into more of an era that I think we're just more familiar with because we're closer to it. But again, we want to just keep in mind that a lot of this has shaped us and impacted us and influenced us more than we realized. I mean, I saw a lot of that even having grown up in the church myself. I see how so much of that thinking is even infiltrated our thinking in the church, and we don't realize to what degree we have really been impacted and shaped by these feminist effects. And so, kind of to fast forward, and I'm sort of skipping through some areas here, but we're really now in the era that they call third wave feminism, which is